So now we have explored 3 different ways to declare our functions. Let's have a look at function parameters and what we call a default. Now let's start off with the function keyword, and here I'm going to say make car. Now because we're learning about parameters, we haven't actually used any of them yet. We want to start understanding these key components of the functions. So what I'm going to say, and I'm going to use a backtick for this, we're going to say making car with a colon, and we're simply going to interpolate it, and we learned about this syntax earlier with ES 2015's multi-line strings, which also support these template literals. Now what we're going to do is expect some kind of name property to be somewhat available in the scope of this function. So what I'm going to do is call toUpperCase on this. So we get something slightly different from what we passed into the function. Now, let's assume we want to make a few different cars. We might want to make a Porsche or a Ferrari. Now, what I'm going to say is this one will be a Porsche and this will be a Ferrari. Now, the piece that we need to work out is how to get these strings down into our console log. Now, if you're somewhat familiar with JavaScript or programming languages, this will be super easy. We can simply pass what we call an argument. Now, there's an interesting piece of knowledge we can drop here. So this name is what we call a parameter. So a parameter is on the receiving end of the function. So the parameter, we can do stuff inside this function and deal with the parameter. And even though this is kind of the same thing from a terminology perspective, these strings that we're passing in are in fact called arguments. So we pass an argument in and we accept it as a parameter. So when you are perhaps at work or talking to someone about functions, you know that parameters are coming through the function. We get given those parameters, but the way that we pass them in is via what we call an argument. Now, they're pretty much 2 different words to explain almost the same thing, but one is where we declare the function and the other is where we use the function. So let's go ahead and hit save on this and we'll just check it out in the console. So here we have Porsche and Ferrari as we'd expected. Now it's interesting because we can call this function as many times as we like. We could even call the function inside of itself, but we'd end up in an infinite loop. Now in the next course masterclass, we'll be talking about the concept of a function calling itself inside of a function, and this is known as recursion. But that's an advanced topic we'll get onto later. So now we've kind of understood parameters, what else can we do with these parameters? Now, it doesn't matter how many of these parameters we can have as many parameters as we like and just keep going and so forth. Obviously, we would have to go ahead and match up the fact that the arguments are also being passed in. So with that knowledge, you know you can create as many parameters and pass as many arguments as you want. There is no limit that we can exceed with this, but obviously keep it sensible. Try and think about functions and break them down into smaller pieces. Ideally, we don't want functions with 8 parameters as it becomes quite difficult to learn and read the code. So an interesting thing happens now when, let's say we have a new developer on the team that's perhaps slightly inexperienced and they just call this make car function on its own. Now, over in the console, you can see that we've now blown up our JavaScript program. We cannot read the property toUpperCase of undefined. So what does this mean? Now, I find the best way of learning is to essentially break things and understand why they're broken. So instead of just going, oh, I've got an error, and diving back to the code and trying to fix it, let's try and understand the error. So it says here that we cannot read a property toUpperCase. So that means that this piece here is some kind of unknown object which does not have a property on it called toUpperCase. Now, if we went ahead and just logged this out, we would then see undefined. So let's go away and just get rid of this. We have undefined. So now we understand that it's undefined. We now know why this toUpperCase doesn't exist on it. So what could we do to sort of get around this problem? And this is where function design comes into play. So here we're going to use one of those conditionals that we learned, and we're going to say if there is no name, then we want to execute a nice block of code here. Now, we haven't looked too deeply at this not operator. We looked at the not, that double bang, to invert the expression and then invert it back. So if this is a truthy value, it's essentially going to skip it because this will then make it false. If it's a falsy value, as in an undefined, so let's just go ahead and say undefined, you can see that this is now true. So it's then going to let us create almost like a fallback, a default value for this name property. Now, typically what we would do in this case is say name equals Porsche and then perhaps supply a default in there. Alternatively, we could do something like this. So we could say that the name equals the name, or we're going to use this or. So we're going to say or it's Porsche. So if this is a truthy value, it will just then reassign name as a new variable, or it's going to fall back to Porsche. So let's demonstrate this one as well. Just save this out and make sure that's what we're getting. Now, if we passed in an empty string, this will then give us Porsche. If we added a few characters, we'd then see this triple X. So there's a few ways that we can create these defaults, but a newer and perhaps much more favorable way that's been added to the language. So what I'll do is just leave these commented out here in separate blocks so we have them for a reference. Now this was added in ES 2015, and as we're using Babel, it will then essentially compile the code back to ES5 and create something like one of these for us, depending on what code we'd like. So instead of saying if there's no name, then name equals this, straight off now, this is a brilliant feature that's been added, but exists in many other languages. We can create that parameter default straight in the function parameter where we declare it. Now, just to prove that this does work, we can add some exclamations, and where we are not supplying an argument, it's then falling back to this default parameter name of Porsche. Now, we're not here to look through all of the use cases, but if you wanted to assign absolutely anything, we could assign an object, we could assign an array, and it's up to you. I'm kind of showing you the ropes of how to use and understand and think about the language, but you can create anything as a default argument inside of here. So with that in mind, we've looked at function parameters, we've looked at this name, we've created some kind of fallback using some conditional logic here. And understanding and using these new ES 2015 features is going to help you be far more productive when it comes to writing JavaScript.